We call to the floor F212. F212 to the floor, testimony in support.
Ellie Klaus Berkner and Associates. A while ago, I was asked to try and put together a chapter on combustible dust where the fire code officials could use it, and it would be, for the most part, a standalone chapter that discusses layer depth and bonding and dust collection. And I put that together about 6 years ago, and it electronically didn't make it through at the last code cycle, so I'm bringing it back in this code cycle. I urge your support. It's intended for inspectors so that they can walk through facilities and be able to assess the majority of the facilities out there, and then for the unique situations, they can still, I've given them authority to be able to apply 652 for the larger facilities or the more dangerous facilities. I urge your support.
Question.
Thank you. You have a question. Barry, down the far end to your left.
Does the standard address the amount of dust that can accumulate and how to clean it?
Yes, there's a layer
Okay,
depth
thank you.
section.
Got another question here, Mr. Stuckey?
No.
No?
Not
Okay.
yet.
All right.
Okay. All right, we are in testimony in support. F212.
Mark Chubb, Intelligent Engineering and Consulting, no client interest, speaking for myself. Again, this, like the previous approved action on G69, improves enforceability and addresses some of the concerns about how you'll manage some of these hazards in the absence of a technical report. If you go into a place with dust and observe some of these conditions, the code official now has very clear guidance about preventative measures that need to be taken to prevent the dust explosion hazard.
Thank you. Further testimony in support, F212. Mr. Nichols.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Dan Nichols, Fire Protection Engineer, speaking on behalf of myself. This chapter has long needed a language update for the code official to go ahead and understand how to navigate where some of these pieces are. I don't know if it solves every issue, but what I can tell you is the list in the beginning that talks about what's not required to further, such as farm operations, so on and so forth, is a nice piece to have in the beginning before you go hunting through a whole bunch of NFPA standards trying to figure out, you know, the gotcha game. Am I really exempt, or do I really have to do something? I went through a couple scenarios, pellet storage for pellet stoves, hops for farm-based craft breweries, and a couple other pieces we've seen, and it's nice to actually have some navigation. It also is nice to have a little section about what your emergency preparedness has to be when you have these types of specific occupancies in your jurisdiction. I urge your support.
Thank you. Further testimony in support, F212. Jeff?
Jeff Shapiro, Ellie ran out of time and had a faux pas. She forgot a modification. She's looking up what it's called. I don't know what it's called, but she says it's important. Is there a Klaus Bruckner one in the house? Two. Okay.
Klaus Bruckner.
I'll move that.
I wondered if that was the case. That is in order.
Okay. Klausbrocker 2. Did I say that right? Ellie 2 has been ruled in order.
Ellie.
Okay. That's okay. Ellie 2 has been ruled in order, and we're going to take testimony in support of
We
the
need the modification up on
We're
the,
going to get it up on the screen before you speak to it, though, okay? There we go.
So the majority of the objections I heard before I came to this meeting were the first two exceptions, which were I was trying to compare similar fire hazards and the MAQs. For example, if something had an NFPA rating of F3 or an F2, what were the MAQs, so we could give the users a reasonable amount to be used without having to apply Chapter 22. But the arguments I'm hearing a lot is there's no scientific basis. I'll leave it up to you guys. I'm giving you both options to leave it in or take those first two options out. It's
Okay.
basically 5 and 10 pounds for sprinklered and unsprinklered amounts in use.
And identify yourself for me.
Ellie too, Ellie Klaus Berkner.
Thank you very much. We are in further testimony in support of the modification, only to the mod, guys.
Yeah, Mark Chubb, Intelligent Engineering and Consulting. I think this is useful if there is genuine opposition to opening the door to materials that aren't consumer goods, but I think there are a number of situations out there that most code officials would not want to get themselves involved in, which are addressed by the first two exceptions, if you feel comfortable leaving them in.
Thank you for the testimony in support of LE2 and opposition of LE2. Seeing no one else wishing to be heard on LE2, we are going back to the main change itself. We are still in supporting testimony on the main change. Anyone else like to be heard in support and opposition?
Good afternoon, Bruce Johnson from UL, and for this proposal, I'm speaking on behalf of myself. And I'd really like to commend Ellie. I agree that this chapter definitely needs some work, but I guess one of the things that would have been really helpful is possibly getting a little bit more involved as kind of the stakeholders and maybe running this through the Fire Code Action Committee. But I want to point out one issue that I think is really a fatal flaw here. In my previous work, I did have firsthand information about the Chemical Safety Board reports on dust incidents, the emergency action that they actually requested from ICC, and ICC was not able to take emergency action, but this committee in the last cycle fixed a very important issue that was raised in those Chemical Safety Board reports back about code deficiencies, and I'll point to the current 2204.1. And that basically reads that the codes and standards listed in the table, which Ellie has repeated, shall be complied with based on the identified or the identification and evaluation of the specific fire hazard. There's no discretion there. That was the main issue that the Chemical Safety Board had. That was an issue with the dust explosion, actually 2 dust explosions in Tennessee. Tennessee has a requirement that they cannot enforce what is believed to be discretionary language. The previous code, the 2015, included what was believed to be discretionary language. That was fixed by this committee, and I see that going back to what would be conceived as discretionary language is a fatal flaw in this proposal. So for that reason, I urge you to disapprove. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition, F212.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Matt Hunter with the American Wood Council. I'd also like to echo Bruce's sentiments on this. The stakeholder involvement, no one really reached out to industry and before this proposal was set forth. There are numerous sections in the proposal that are direct conflict with widely accepted industry practices and 3 separate NFPA standards which have been discussed previously, 652, 654, and 664. One of the comments specifically with regards to dust collection systems, the proposal completely leaves out enclosureless dust proposal collection systems, which are currently permitted under both NFPA 654 and 666. There are also references in the proposal requiring marking of deflagration vent discharge areas in an approved manner. I think this needs to be addressed and some additional guidance needs to be provided there. Restricting hose length of these low pressure, low velocity compressed air systems is also an issue. Industry frequently uses hose lengths to service equipment like flying saws with lengths of hosing exceeding 8 to 10 feet in length. And they do this to specifically avoid exposing personnel to confined spaces or other hazardous spaces. So we would object to those limitations. Additionally, there's the velocities that are listed for fine wood dust and some other dusts are in conflict with the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, or the ACGIH. We urge disapproval. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition, F212. Mr. Davis.
Robert Davis, Davis Hood Concepts. Speaking for myself, no client interest. Had Ellie taken the existing language that's in there that sets up the utilization of 652 as a mandatory use of this and go to the other appropriate standards, and then worked in some other basic language in here to give more readily available tools to a fire code official, that would have been a much better option here. But to put language in where combustibility or explosibility screening tests are required to analyze permissive language, and really where do you get that from? You get that from a dust hazard analysis, and then make the dust hazard analysis if required by a fire code official. Now, There's been this talk about all these standards, all this technical language and engineer involvement and everything. A fire code official is either knowledgeable enough to do this, to make that, if they can make that decision on when they require it, well, then obviously you're capable to deal with those standards anyway, because if they're not able to deal with all those standards and everything's in there, then they're not able to actually make an appropriate decision on this, all right? The key issue of the last year's work was to say, this is where you go. This is what you have to do. Now, when I look at it, that dust hazard is where required, and then for existing facilities in accordance to 712-652, but it's where required. You go to 652, it's mandatory. It's mandatory if you find a hazard. It's mandatory every 2 years. Now, we're not the only ones working this topic, all right? What we did last year made it mandatory. The Chemical Safety Board, that's what they want. They actually wanted mandatory language saying the fire code official shall enforce this, and we talked them out of it because we told them, well, that's not what you put in the code. They wanted it, all right? OSHA wanted it. The feds say we need new laws and standards because this has to happen. But we're going to make it, well, if you determine it's required, we're going to do that. But when something goes wrong, the higher agencies are going to investigate and point all the fingers. No. They expect you to apply 652 and go from 652 to the appropriate standard. I think you're doing a disservice to the code officials the way it is structured now.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition? New info.
Marcelo Herscher, GBH International for NEFRA. I am particularly concerned about section 2203.3.2. It says plastic, fiberglass, other non-conductive ducts, duct liners, or pipes shall not be used as part of blah, blah, blah. I am very strongly opposed to identifying a particular material class in general. If you, what you need to do is put the appropriate performance requirements, like the next sentence, which is fine. Ductwork utilizing combustible shall be made only in high impact and where approved. This is the kind of, but automatically eliminating anything like plastic, fiberglass, any non-conductive dust. So any concrete duct is unacceptable, it's non-conductive, so you can't have a concrete duct. Why? Please disapprove.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition? Rebuttal in support. 1 minute.
It seldom takes me to get angry and take offense. And 6 years ago, I approached FCAC with this code change. I promised them I would make this code change, prepare a code change. I approached it. I submitted it to them over and over again. And we put together an FCAC subcommittee that fell apart. I've gone to SoCal FPOs, and 4 years ago, I believe Mr. Metz was at that meeting, if I'm not wrong, but we spent about 5-6 hours on this chapter. And then at this code cycle again, I tried to talk to FCAC and figure out what their issues were. And the only issues were the mandatory 652 and the first two exceptions. I have not heard anything else. And so to say that I did not help participate is offensive.
Thank you. Now, do me a favor, Ellie, I don't want you to be offended, but identify yourself.
Pissed off Ellie too? Ellie Klaasbergner. So
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Further rebuttal in support.
Yeah, Mark Chubb, Intelligent Engineering and Consulting. The issue of OSHA and the relationship to the fire code and CSB and the relationship to the fire code was brought up yesterday in another area, and it's interesting to hear the opponents now speaking of it in a little bit different fashion than we heard it yesterday. If CSB wants to see changes in this area, then those changes can and should come from OSHA. If states who wish to enforce state programs in the occupational safety and health area do not comply with the federal norms, they lose funding. The approach that CSB appears to have taken to come down to the state and local level and ask them to do Fed OSHA's job is inappropriate. There's a realm for OSHA to operate in, and there's a realm for the fire code to operate in, and what Ellie's proposing is an appropriate degree of discretion for state and local officials.
Thank you. For the rebuttal in support.
So Jeff Shapiro again on my own behalf. The implication here is that by requiring compliance with 652, you're getting all kinds of prescriptive enforcement. You're not. If you read 652 and you get a dust hazard analysis, all the things you do are subjective based on the person who's reading the standard and trying to apply it to a particular application. So simply mandating 652 in all cases doesn't get you a mandatory prescriptive approach to managing this stuff. It just gets somebody to look at it. We have that through the technical report, or we have it through that which references 652 and the code official who is doing their job as they do on every other technical issue like this. There's nothing wrong with this. I would suggest that what Ellie has done is a better framework for going forward, and perhaps if there are things that need to be improved, work with where Ellie is at now in the public comment period, as opposed to trying to work with what's currently in the code that we're having some trouble with.
Thank you for the rebuttal and support. There's a couple of Me Too waves. Rebuttal and opposition. 1 minute.
Robert Davis, David Cook Concepts. Jeff's right. You start your point in 652, but then it also tells you, then go to the appropriate standard dealing with the hazards that are in that occupancy. That's the way it's structured. You know, and even in that case, we've made those voluntary here, whether or not we ever get to them, use them, and apply them. Ellie's also correct, because I was on that group with her too that fell apart last cycle, all right? And it was at the last minute that I said, I'll put something in because we had nothing, and they wanted to get something in. And we had some discussions this cycle too that, well, they were for it before they were against it, and to be honest with you, the last vote that I remember on a phone call was, why don't we just let Ellie and Bob duke it out in front of the mic?
Further rebuttal and opposition. Seeing no one wishing to be heard, Mr. Chair, F212 is yours.
Thank you. Committee, I need a motion on F212, please.
Move as submitted.
Got a motion and a second for as submitted, sir?
With intent to modify.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, all right, I got a second on that.
I got to try.
What's your
start someplace.
modification?
Klaus, LA2.
Okay.
Klaus Bruckner 2, AKA.
Klaus Bruckner, 2. Yes, let's see, I got a second on that, right? Okay, and discussion on the modification. Thank you, Sarah.
I kind of liked that language that was in there because it gave some kind of definition to some minor uses of, or not uses, but instances where you're going to end up with combustible dust in a certain quantity. But I have to say, when I look at the quantity limits, it talks about the 5 pounds and the 10 pounds. Where, how, measure, depth, space, area, how to come up with that 5 and 10 pounds, and that's where I was struggling with. So taking it out at the moment, if there's a way you can modify it to bring it back in a public comment to address that, such as more quantitatively determined.
Thank you. Any further discussion on the modification? Mr. Francis.
Ironically, 652 tells you how to do that collection and measurement to determine those quantities in numbers 1 and 2.
Bring back 652.
And so that's one of the reasons I favored that approach.
Thank you. Sarah, did you have more comments?
If that was the intent, then I would have had some direct connection to 652 as the means by which to establish that.
Thank you. Any further discussion on the modification? We're voting on the modification only. Klaus Bruckner 2. All those in favor of the modification, please raise your hand. And those opposed? That passes 10 to 4, 9 to 4. So we are back to the motion of F212 as modified by Klaus Bruckner 2. Discussion on the proposal as a whole.
So this has been a topic that's incredibly hard to get your hands around if you're both in the professional side or you're in the enforcement side. Combustible dust is a very, I'm going to use nebulous topic because it's in the air, so to say. Yeah, it's getting late. Just the direct reference to 652 brings in a lot of, okay, I'm a consultant, it's business, but it's will direct you in a path that for a very small entity, such as the functions that Ellie spoke about, a craft brewery or a bakery, a small business, this is to go to 652 and then direct it down that entire path, and also to then possibly all these other standards. It's so massive, and you may end up at a result, when you get there, nothing's a problem. But you have to have gone through this very large analysis, which is a good analysis, but very cumbersome and time-consuming and effort. She's given some real quick direction to the I personally think, I would think the local jurisdictions would think of this as a tool, because now if they have an instance where there is a situation where there's combustible dust, they're given some I'm never going to get that word.
Specificity.
I'm proud of you. Specific direction. But it also really includes in 2205.1.1, if a dust hazard analysis is required by the fire official. That's the power there, that if you've got a local jurisdiction who doesn't feel comfortable with seeing all the provisions that are now going to be in here, it gives them the power still to have to require that dust hazard analysis. And I think it should be brought in the code.
Thank you, Sarah. Mr. Stuckey.
I'm speaking in support of F212, and part of it is that we are finally going to formalize bringing it in FPH 652. I've spent a fair amount of time in 652, and one of the beautiful things that 652 has is what we call a go, no-go test. And it's not that difficult of a test to have done. And that one test, yes, it costs money. Yes, it will take time. Yes, there's things that happens, but can give you a quantitative answer as to what you have. And then from that, further analysis can be done, or you can conclude that you don't have a problem. That's just some of the things that we have with this. This is an interesting turn of events that we're now finally starting to deal with this, because as a code official, I've been dealing with it now for close to 20 years. And I was dealing it when I didn't have a 652, and in a lot of cases, I ended up relying on factory mutual standards to help me solve it. Everything has now since progressed upon that. Career-wise for me, this is like just another progression and better understanding of hazards that we have. I understand CSB's been looking at it hard for not doing anything with it, but the issue of it is that if you're in the fire service, you start off generally, and you always learn the fire triangle. With dust, I've always equated it as a dust pentagon. So now it's 5-sided, and the other 2 sides aren't really all that easy. And that's where some of this complication happens. And so this starts us down the pathway to where we can have the discussions of doing refinement and those type of things. And I think this is a very good code change.
Thank you, Mr. Stuckey. Mr. Francis.
Standards like 664 have within them the very exemptions that we're talking about. That in 664, wood dust producing facilities under, used to be 2,100, I forget the number, 2,100 square feet are exempt from that, and I can't get there anymore. I can't be exempt because I can't get directly to 664. The same occurs in the other standards. That's my main heartburn with this.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion on the motion for as submitted? Seeing none, all those in favor of as submitted, please raise your hand. Yep. Sorry, did I miss something? Thank you. Thank you. I did forget to mark that modified down. Yes. Yes, we are as modified by Klaus Bruckner 2. Thank you, Mark. All those in favor of the motion of as modified, please raise your hand. And those opposed? That motion passes 11-3. Mr. Moderator, F212 has been approved as modified.
Committee action on F212 is for approval as modified. Is there a motion for assembly action?
10 to
Seeing
3,
none.
sorry. 10 to 3.
Seeing none.
Mr. Chairman, I'm recusing myself for